2015 meeting of the Zoning Board of Appeals for the City of Troy to order. I would, before the roll call, I'd just like to introduce the people up here at the dais to the general public here tonight. And to my far left, your right, is Mr. Lambert, who's a member of the board. Then Mr. Eisenbacher, who is the vice chairman. This is Mr. Sanzika, who is a member of this board, but he's also a member of the Planning Commission. And to my right is Mr. Desmond, then Mr. Neal, then Mr. Courtney. This is the Zoning Board of Appeals that I just referenced a second ago. Then over here to the side is Mr. Evans, who is the city administrator, who is our liaison on this board. And then to his right is Ms. Dufresne, who is the assistant city attorney for the city of Troy, who serves as our legal advisor to this body. So at this point in time, I'd like to call on Mr. Evans to call the roll so we can proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Clark?
Here.
Mr. Courtney?
Here.
Mr. Desmond?
Here.
Mr. Eisenbacher?
Here.
Mr. Neal?
Here.
Mr. Lambert?
Here.
Mr. Sanzika?
We have quorum. I failed to identify myself. I'm Glenn Clark, and I'm the chairman of this board. Item number 2 is the approval of minutes, but before we do that, I'm going to call on Mr. Eisenbacher, who's the vice chairman, to give us the rules and procedures that this body has approved for itself.
The Zoning Board of Appeals is a group of 7 of your neighbors appointed by City Council to decide on requests for variances and other matters that are brought before them. A variance is a relaxation of the literal provisions of the zoning ordinance. Petitioners must indicate a hardship or practical difficulty with the land that would warrant the granting of the variance. Procedure. The board will hear the items in the order that they appear on the agenda. When an item is called, the chairman will verify that the petitioner is present. The city administration will then summarize the facts of the case. The petitioner will then be given an opportunity to address the board to explain the justification for the action requested. After the petitioner makes their presentation and answers any questions that the board may have, the chairman will open the public hearing. Any person wishing to speak on the request should raise their hand and, when recognized by the chairman, come up to the podium and sign in on the sheet provided. The speaker should identify themselves with name and address, indicate their relationship to the property in question, for example, next door neighbor or live behind the property, and state whether they are in favor or against the variance request and give reasons for this opinion. Comments must be directed through the chairman. Comments should be kept as brief as possible and closely pertain to the matter under consideration. Only one person will be recognized by the chairman to speak at one time. At the conclusion of public comments, the chairman will close the public hearing. Once the public hearing is closed, no other public comment will be taken unless in response to a specific question by a member of the board. The board will then make a motion to approve, deny, or postpone the request. In order for the request to pass, a minimum of 4 votes are needed. If the request is not granted, the applicant has the right to appeal the board's decision to the Oakland County Circuit Court.
Thank you, Vice Chairman Eisenbacher. So at this point in time, we can move on with item number 2, which is approval of minutes. Are there any questions or comments by members of the board regarding this issue? Hearing none, I believe we were prepared for a vote, a motion by a member. Mr. Sanzika?
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
You're moving?
Approve the minutes.
Okay. Is there a second to that motion?
Second.
Seconded by Eisenbacher. Any discussion on the motion? Seeing none, Mr. Evans, I believe we're prepared to vote.
Mr. Courtney?
Yes.
Mr. Desmond?
Yes.
Mr. Eisenbacher?
Yes.
Mr. Neal?
Yes.
Mr. Lambert?
Yes.
Mr. Sanzika? Mr. Clark?
Yes. Motion is approved. Now we're moving on to item number 3, which is approval of the agenda, and I would like to call on the city attorney's representative, Ms. Dufresne.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With respect to item number 3, approval of the agenda, I would like to clarify for the board, as those of you who were here last month may recall, during our March 17th meeting, we had an issue presented where we took 4 votes. We had 2 motions to deny a certain variance request, and we had 2 motions to approve a certain variance request. As those of you who are here may recall, we did not have all 7 members present. We had 6 members present. And prior to the beginning of that hearing, we did ask the applicant if he was willing to proceed, even though he didn't have a full board. He said that he would. Upon reflection, when a matter does not receive a majority vote, that matter, as a matter of course, fails. So though we took 4 votes, we never were able to achieve a majority vote. All 4 of those motions technically fail. I, at this point, would recommend to the board that you remove item number 4A under hearing of cases, the variance request of David J. Perdun for 1321 Boyd Street, unless the applicant can come forward with new evidence that wasn't available at the time that the variance was denied or didn't pass. I guess the majority was unable to be achieved. He would have to wait another year before he can bring this request back to the board. So my recommendation is that the board remove item 4A from tonight's agenda.
Thank you, Ms. Dufresne. I would just say that your interpretation of procedural rules, from my perspective, is absolutely correct. And just for the public that may have come out here tonight on this important matter, I'd just like to mention that we did have a large number of votes on this matter, and yes, indeed, there was not a majority that wanted to move forward in any particular area. So this was a slight oversight, and of course, we aren't going to be able to take this matter up before this body here tonight. I would like to call upon Mr. Evans and ask him simply that if somebody obviously wanted to wait until public comment, which is item number 7, they could share their thoughts on any future petition by any potential property owner in the city of Troy, in general terms, because at this point in time, just for clarification, there isn't a request since, as Ms. Dufresne pointed out, there's no new information that the petitioner is bringing forward to the board. So, Mr. Evans, do you want to address that, please?
Yeah, anyone can come up during item number 7 on the agenda, public comment, if they wish to speak about any item that pertains to the zoning board.
Sure. And at this point in time, I'd like to call on board members. If there's a comment or a question of the city administration, please, Mr. Sanzica.
I'm just curious, as a matter of fact in this situation, was it a fact that there were 2 motions, one to fail and one to pass, that were tied, that why the motion failed entirely, or was it just one tie vote?
Well, it was appropriate to do, because the first motion, I believe, was to deny. So it was appropriate to have a second motion in the opposite direction to approve. But that was also a tie vote. So technically, we should not have proceeded with the remaining 2. Again, we took another motion for denial and a motion for approval. Technically, when the second motion to approve failed, we had no majority on either one of those motions. We should have stopped at that point.
Okay, thank you.
And I would just like to point out that I think the reason we continue to work our way on that issue is there was a healthy level of discussion amongst our colleagues here. So I feel that people had new information. I remember a couple of individuals said, wow, I hadn't thought of it in that way, because somebody commented. And so there was an opportunity potentially to find a majority one direction or the other. So I think we were trying to give the petitioner his day in hearing, and there was many people from the neighborhood that were here as well. So we wanted to fully include all of that, and that's why we're at where we're at, unfortunately. So any other comments? Mr. Courtney.
Mr. Chairman, just so the petitioner doesn't feel bad, I was opposed to this particular process years ago, and I have not changed my mind, and that would be the 4th vote. Unless other people have changed their mind, that would be the 4th vote tonight to deny. So you haven't lost anything by this legal decision.
And Mr. Courtney wasn't here last month, so that, I think that's the reason he wanted to make his comment. Mr. Neal, was there a comment?
No.
No, okay. Mr. Vice Chairman?
If there's no comments on the matter, I think that the point in front of this board is to modify the agenda to remove item 4A, and thus I'd like to move that, to remove item 4A from the agenda.
I believe it's not, a vote isn't required. This is like an administrative phase. Ms. Dufresne, you want to address that?
No, you do need, because the agenda is already set, you do need to take a vote to
Okay.
remove it from the agenda.
There's a motion and a second to remove 4A from tonight's business agenda. Are there any comments by members? Seeing none, Mr. Evans, please call the vote.
Mr. Desmond?
Yes.
Mr. Eisenbacher?
Yes.
Mr. Neal?
Yes.
Mr. Lambert?
Yes.
Mr. Sanzika? Mr. Clark?
Yes.
Mr. Courtney?
Yes.
So this item is no longer before this body, and if you'd like to stay and comment on anything related to that former agenda before this body, you're more than welcome to address the board under item number 7. But once again, this is no longer a petition before this body. Moving on to number 4B, this is related to a variance request as related to Ellie Sasson at 6022 Atkins. Mr. Evans, do you want to present to the board?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This request, as printed in the agenda, is for Ellie Sasson at 6022 Atkins in order to build a new house, a 25-foot variance from the 50-foot required setback from Square Lake Road. The required setback is measured from the future Square Lake Road right-of-way. I'd like to direct everybody's attention to the overheads to the left, right, and behind the board. The first overhead displayed is aerial of the neighborhood. The property at 6022 Atkins is in the lower left, outlined in a red triangle. Square Lake Road is running left and right near the bottom of it, and John R. is to the right. I've zoomed in on the neighborhood. This property is located specifically at the intersection of Atkins and Square Lake on the corner. It is the triangular-shaped property that we do see in the aerial. And I've taken this photo and overlaid in yellow the zoning classification, and the subject property and all surrounding property is zoned single-family residential. The applicant proposes to construct a new house just like the one shown here in this photo, and that's the back of the house. And in order to do that, he's requesting a setback variance. Now, in this drawing here, we have Atkins here, Square Lake is at the bottom, and he's delineated the building envelope in a large triangle on the property, and this is the footprint of the proposed house. Now, we can see a red line over here. That's the proposed, the required setback line from the Square Lake Road right-of-way. Because Square Lake Road is a major thoroughfare, he needs to maintain a 50-foot setback from the future right-of-way of Square Lake Road. He is proposing to encroach into that setback by 25 feet, so this blue portion of the house would enter into the proposed setback. Square Lake Road, as defined by the master plan, is planned to be a 120-foot wide right-of-way, so it's 60 feet on either side. So in order to build the house as he's proposing, he's going to need a 25-foot setback variance from the Square Lake Road future right-of-way. I'll turn it back over to the board for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Are there questions of the city administration on this matter? Mr. Lambert?
Yes, Mr. Evans, and I saw Mr. Courtney's hand up too, so he's probably going to ask the same question, so I'll beat him to the punch. If the board were to approve the variance and the city eventually widens Square Lake, which could be 15 to 20 years from now, but still it could occur in the future, does that have any implications for the taxpayers of the city as far as compensating the property owner for widening the road and acquiring the property?
Well, in general, when the city does acquire property, it is based on fair market value, and the city is obligated to pay fair market value. So depending on the potential design of the road and how it may impact the structure, it could potentially have an impact on the cost of that.
Thank you.
Mr. Courtney?
Normally, though, the road would the road actually end up in the house? In other words, the right-of-way normally doesn't extend enough that you're cutting the house then.
Yeah, and in this drawing here, this solid
Yeah.
black line is the proposed right-of-way line. So this is a 25-foot setback that he's looking for. So he would still have, if a variance was granted, based on what we know now, he would still have a 25-foot front yard that would be private property and not part of the right-of-way.
We wouldn't normally be required to buy the house. Is this house now going to be a bigger footprint than the current house?
Yes.
Do you? Okay, thank you.
Mr. Sanzica?
Yeah, I was, could you describe what the existing right-of-way is now on Square Lake Road? Or Squire Lake Road, as is shown in the drawing?
Yeah, I'm going to zoom in closer on a map here. Whoop. The existing right-of-way, well, as the property description goes, the southerly property line actually goes through the pavement on Square Lake Road. I know there are some laws that talk about when a highway is built, what part of the road, even though it might be technically on public property, becomes part of the highway. But the way this property is currently laid out now is that it's got several property lines going down the middle of streets. So if this road were widened, that would be adjusted accordingly as part of the right-of-way takings.
So, I guess what I'm trying to understand is
Yeah.
who owns the property now adjacent to the road? And it sounds,
The
I
property
didn't realize
owner.
that it's right to the center line of the road.
Yeah. Well, the property owner owns it, except for possibly what maybe a state law considers the road and adjacent shoulder, the actual usable part of the road.
So if the road were to be widened, you would have to acquire the property, the additional 50-foot property from the,
Yeah, that would be typical.
60-foot from
Yeah.
the property owner. And there's still a 50-foot setback from the proposed
Yes.
60-foot right-of-way.
Right. So in effect, we're going 60 feet from the platted middle of the road back for the future right-of-way, and then the zoning ordinance requires buildings be another 50 feet north of that.
So when this lot was platted, it wasn't anticipated that
I don't think so.
it wouldn't be I don't know if it would be a billable lot or not with that right-of-way taken out of it and the setback, but
It would be a buildable lot. The surveyor has done a good job of superimposing, whoop, I'm going the wrong way here, sorry. This red triangle would indicate the buildable area, and quite possibly the surveyor or representatives of the applicant could give you a better idea of the viability of what could be put inside the red triangle as opposed to the building envelope that he's shown that includes the requested variance.
thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else for city administration? Seeing no other members at this time, if the petitioner's here, please come forward. Please identify yourself in relationship to the property. And then sign in also, please. And if you're both going to be speaking, then you'll both have to sign in.
My name is Zoran Bogdanovich, and I've been obtained by Mr. Sassine as his builder for the property.
Good evening.
Good evening.
You can begin.
One of the, I think the most confusing part of this parcel has been what is considered the setback, the row, what's proposed and what's official. I think we were going back and forth. And when we look at totality, we're looking about 110 feet from the road as far as a total setback. So point of clarification, what we're trying to do, if angle the house to try to fit it into what we would consider if the proposed was a set official setback, how do we angle that house and can we build a buildable home for his expanding family? He currently lives in Troy today. He's got 3 kids and a wife, and they've all outgrown the home. This home is just shy of 3,000 square feet. The current home on the property is just a little over 1,000 square feet. But this whole parcel is actually an acre. So the angles make it very difficult to fit the size home he's requesting for his family, even if we pushed it back as close as we could into that red triangle, which would be the proposed variance. So when we first took on this project, the project was what we felt compliant with what's existing today as the setbacks from the row. And if you take a look at the map and the aerial photo, you'll see that this home would be in line with all the homes along Square Lake. And if you were to, if the city in the future did decide to push back and take 50 feet, you're going to be in the lake on the other side, the further you go west. So just on the other side of Atkins.
Okay.
So just a couple points of clarification. That's all we were trying to figure out there, how to make this work and how to make a buildable home for his family. Is there any questions from, yeah?
Mr. Eisenbacher.
Yes, looking at the layout picture that Mr. Evans had up. Yep. It looks like the house, if it were placed further north, parallel with Atkins, in that direction that he's indicating with the mouse, it would reduce your need for variance. Is there a particular reason you didn't move it in that direction?
Well, he wanted some side setback from the neighbors as well, not to be so close to the neighbor. There's a garage right next to that 8-foot setback, which is the neighbor. And the way that neighbor's designed, it's a horseshoe around him, his driveway. So he basically would be closer to that driveway and that garage in that area. And I think it becomes somewhat challenging because we did play with that, and that's a very good question. We're starting to shave considerable amount of living space off, or we would have to take away from the garage to really try to squeeze it in there. So basically going from 3,000, I think it came down to about 2,450 or 2,550, somewhere in that area as far as total square feet of livable space.
Okay. And then looking at this picture, if you were to add on a deck or any other accessory buildings, it looks like all the available buildable space is being largely taken up. Did you have plans for a deck?
There's been no mention, there's nothing on the plans, and there was no mention of a deck that he even wanted to consider a deck.
Because that gets very difficult.
Typically, if you take a look at the way this house is designed, and if you can see the little envelope toward the bottom where it's there, right there, that's basically where your deck would be. It would be within the parameters of the house if you drew another triangle on the back. And most likely, if you've seen the house that we did build, that is a stone or a brick type paver. Yeah, well, it's not in this, but yeah, this is the home, but the way it's encroached right there, that's all now brick pavers in there. So it wouldn't extend beyond further outside the house.
Mr. Lambert.
So it looks like, based upon the plans that you've submitted, that your primary difficulty with the property is its unusual shape and size and how it's kind of lodged between Atkins, which most of the streets in Troy don't tend to intersect with a major road that way, but you have to deal with it as it is.
Yes, it's an unusual parcel of land that we're trying to work with.
Okay.
And I think, just a note, there's been discussions with neighbors that there's been challenges with that property being vacant for so many years. And a couple have welcomed the renderings we've had and thought it would be a nice addition to the community.
Any other member for the petitioner? Seeing none, if you could have a seat, sir, thank you. And at this time, what we're going to do is call the public hearing on this matter, so the general public can let the board know your thoughts. If you'd like to address the board on this matter, please step forward and identify yourself. Seeing no one at this time, I'm going to close the public hearing, and I'm going to call on Vice Chairman Eisenbacher to give us any information from the public via email or letter.
I see absolutely nothing.
Thank you. So now we're going to bring it back to the board and for any discussion or business related to this application. Mr. Desmond?
Well, I mean, I'm pretty intimately familiar with this property. I know it's been, it's down the block from my house. I've actually shown this property a couple times over several years, and it is an utterly unique piece of real estate as far as, you know, most of anything else I've seen in Troy. And actually, every time I've driven past it, I've thought, what could you possibly do with this? I mean, and when I joined this board, it was one of the first things I thought is somebody's going to bring this parcel up to the board at some point, because if they're ever going to do anything with it, it's going to need, you know, a variance granted. The only thing that I could see as being as an alternative, just because of the widening of the street being a potential issue, is, you know, if they're requesting the setback, I mean, does it have to be on the Square Lake side versus the Atkins side, you know, which I heard mention of the garage, but I know that there's an existing barn there. Is that the garage that you're talking about, that other structure that's the dilapidated, and that's the neighbors, that's not connected to this property?
Sir? if
I'm
you'd like-
sorry, I asked.
Just to ask the chair to,
Okay.
you know, I can bring him back to the podium.
Well, I guess that would be, if that extra structure is part of the property of this parcel, or does that belong to another? Because that's like, right, that parallels Atkins. So if they can remove that, then it just seems like the setback issue, if they shifted it a little bit, then it wouldn't interfere with the potential widening of the street, which is the only thing I could see as being a negative.
Would you like to call the petitioner?
Yeah, if possible.
Petitioner would like to come back to the podium and address the member's question.
Pushing it further back toward it's unusual because we kind of have two frontages here. It's either Square Lake or Atkins. Pushing it back, I think the required backside setbacks, Paul, if you can, is that a 25-foot? We're at capacity right there as we speak, aren't we?
Along Square Lake or Atkins? You satisfy the setbacks along Atkins, also along the side yard, but the setback from Square Lake would need to be 50. Does that answer your question?
Correct. That's correct. Correct.
I guess that's my
Yep,
question. I mean,
that's
if you're going to
correct.
take it from someplace, wouldn't it be better to get the variance on the side that's less likely to interfere with the main road?
I guess what you have, I understand where you're going with that. You have, in totality, about 110 feet on this side, so it seemed like the best area to position the home where it's not so pushed to the back and to the side. It just makes, if you can, you drive by it, if you can make, how you make that angle, are you a part of Square Lake now in Atkins, or are you just more toward now flowing this way into Atkins? It's very difficult to turn that house to make, where's your frontage? You know, we're trying to do away with the dual frontage by angling it more to the left. Now, to the right, you'd be, when you drive into Atkins, the more we tilt it or rotate it, you'd look at the side of the house. You wouldn't see more frontage until you actually drove by the house. Looking back, you would see the frontage, if this makes any sense.
Mr. Lambert?
I think what, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what Mr. Desmond may be asking is, and this, however we deal with this, is probably going to be a variance, but if we moved the house closer to Atkins to reduce some of the variance on Square Lake, is that a possibility from your client's point of view? And I know we'd have to talk to city staff to see what their take on it was, but from your client's point of view, would they be acceptable to move the house a little bit closer to Atkins?
I don't think that'd be an issue, yeah,
Okay.
if you did move toward Atkins.
And honestly, I'm
Yeah.
for the idea of this. I just, the question is, in the future, if there is an expansion of that road, is that going to, how potentially problematic is that going to be ahead of time? That is all.
Yeah.
Anything else you'd like to add? Yes, sir.
Anyone else, any more questions?
Okay.
Okay.
For the petitioner or for the board?
Well,
Okay, you can have a seat, thank you.
well, maybe for him too, he may know the right-of-way. The right-of-way along Atkins, what is the setback there? Do you have room to move closer without getting a variance on Atkins?
That would be a question for city administration.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's got the, is that a covered porch you're going to have along Atkins?
Correct.
Then he's right up to the 25-foot
Correct.
required setback line.
Okay, I personally feel that along Square Lake, even though it's a big variance, I don't think he's going to interfere with the road any more than other structures that are along Square Lake, going from Crooks all the way across, coming east from Crooks. There are a lot of houses that are going to be closer to the road when it's finally built than this would be with the variance.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else for the petitioner? Okay, you can have a seat, sir. Thank you. Vice Chairman Eisenbacher.
I believe that's a very good point, because I was just looking at Google Earth and then remembering traveling through that area and what the petitioner had mentioned. As long as this house is no closer than the 6 houses to the west of it, and then to the west of those 6 houses that are closest to Square Lake is a cemetery. And widening a road across a cemetery is very difficult because of the individual ownership of the plats and all the laws involved there. So I don't believe even if Square Lake is widened, it would be widened in that direction, largely because of that cemetery.
Thank you. Any other members for business or comments? Mr.
I have
Lambert.
a question for staff. Under existing city code, the builder would be required to build a sidewalk on both Atkins and Square Lake for this property, unless the traffic committee gave them a variance?
I know it should be Atkins. I'm not sure about Square Lake.
Is it possible for us to stipulate as part of the approval, I don't know if there's a majority in favor, but to stipulate that a sidewalk be built on the Square Lake side?
I think if we could justify that it's reasonably related to the variance, I guess I'd have to hear the justification for
Okay.
doing that.
Thanks.
Justification, Mr. Evans, be that there's a school across the street? School children walking to and from the building?
I guess if the board as a whole is comfortable that that reasonably
Sure.
fits granting.
Mr. Courtney?
Well, I like sidewalks. I fail to see why one would be of use there, since there's no kids to walk there.
There are other homes in the area.
Not down that way.
I don't think I think it's
You
drainage there.
have a very large church, and you have
They're all facing the other direction.
all the houses and all the kids are further north and west.
Mr. Lambert, do you want to address any of that?
No, I was just
Okay.
curious, wanted the question answered, so.
Any other?
If the church built a sidewalk all the way down, then I could see people would want to walk, but
Okay. Are there any members who'd like to make a motion or further comment? Mr. Evans, if I could just have a quick question. of you and maybe the city attorney, you know, I think it is unusual for us to have an irregular shaped parcel that this board has dealt with on a major thoroughfare or connecting to a major thoroughfare. And I'm sure maybe it's been taken care of here, but I can't recall. Anyway, having said that, I mean, as far as the setback, and also, I guess, the legal precedence for talking about eminent domain, an eminent domain purchase about a potential parcel simply because it is on a major thoroughfare, is that really in the jurisdiction of this board? I'm just curious because I can see how it could be and potentially could not be, but at the end of the day, it's, you know, we're not hearing anything from the city saying this isn't the plans, you know, the 5-year plan, the roads plan, where this is planned, we're going to have funding by year, whatever. So could you just deal with that? It just seems to be a black hole for me to try and put some fingerprints on.
Well, what I can say is even though the city perhaps might not even have design plans for the road, the master plan, which is the master plan for many things in the city, does call for a 120-foot wide right-of-way in that location. It's common that those right-of-ways are eventually achieved through the acquisition by the city of the necessary land for the road. So, you know, as the project potentially gets closer to in the planning stages, more specific in design stages, that's going to be the time that it's going to be appropriate for the city to do whatever needs to be done to acquire the right-of-way. So we're not there right now, but the master plan does call for it, and that's what we have as our guide.
Did you have, Mrs. Dufresne?
While I can appreciate the board's concern with respect to possible future takings issue, this board really should limit its inquiry into the characteristics of the land, the shallowness, the narrowness, you know, the characteristic. The takings issue is not really related to the characteristics of this particular parcel at this point. It's an issue that could be considered, and I appreciate the board's being concerned with that, but it really is a little bit outside of the purview of the issue at hand.
So would that mean that an inquiry of the city engineer on this matter would be an overstep?
No, absolutely. If you would like to get more information from engineering as to where the city is in having that road expanded, absolutely. That's definitely within your purview. And you know, if you would like more information, absolutely, we can obtain additional information for you.
Thank you. I'd just like to have a comment. I think potentially, and I think Mr. Eisenbacher's comments were well taken related to the parcel in question vis-a-vis the cemetery. But I also believe that, as Mr. Evans mentioned, the city does have a master plan, and the expansion of the road is part of that. And as a taxpayer, not that I represent the city, I represent the general public, I just feel like the general public has a right to know that before a decision can be made from my one perspective. And so I would like to have that information before I cast a vote. And I think it would be wise of this board potentially to have that inquiry made through city administration and be reported back to us by the next meeting. Mr. Evans?
Well, I've got an answer for you because I came to
excellent.
my answer.
Why didn't you
because-
say so?
Well, I wasn't sure where the board as a whole was going to go with this.
Okay.
I talked to Bill Hootery, the traffic engineer. We don't have any specific plans in the works, and his recommendation was the answer that I gave you earlier. Right now, what we do know is the master plan, and just because we might have a contract or anything specific now, that could change. Now, it's hard to say when it changes, but we know the only definitive thing we know is that the guide that's going to tell us how it's going to change is the master plan. So Bill recommended, because he doesn't have a specific answer as to when that road might be widened, that the answer to that should be we all have to rely on the master plan, because that is the only information that we have relative to what might happen.
Very good. Well, I appreciate your due diligence, seriously, that you would take the extra step and do that for, on behalf of the board, for information sharing here tonight. Are there any other comments or questions? Mr. Eisenbacher?
If this board does not approve the variance, the value of this property is substantially less. Once this variance is approved, the value of the property increases substantially because it becomes buildable. If and when the city comes through and has a taking of the back of the property, you're taking from a much more valuable property than it would otherwise be if this variance were not accepted. Because, like the gentleman said, you can only build a very small house without a variance. And you're taking the backyard away from a large house then in the future with the future right-of-way.
Mr. Sanzica?
I guess the obvious question that comes to my mind is it appropriate to ask for the petitioner to dedicate that right-of-way at this time? It's subject to the approval of the setback variance.
Is the inquiry of the city administration or the city attorney?
Would it be appropriate to ask the petitioner if he were to volunteer that right-of-way at this time, since it is part of his lot, if he would be willing to dedicate that to the road right-of-way at this time, rather than at a future taking?
Feel that. With respect to imposing conditions, those conditions that this board can impose should be limited to public health, safety, and welfare issues. I'm not sure it's appropriate to ask, I'm not sure it's appropriate for this board to ask the applicant to dedicate the road. It's not really related to health, safety, and welfare issues. It's related to monetary issues.
Are there any members who'd like to step up and make a comment or a motion? Mr. Lambert?
Mr. Clark, I'm going to move that we approve the variance based upon the unusual characteristics of the property and the fact that it will not infringe or harm the nature of the existing neighborhood.
Thank you. Is there a second to the Lambert motion? Mr. Desmond, I think, made the motion. Second. If there is any questions or comments now, please feel free to make a comment on the motion. Seeing there aren't any comments by members, Mr. Evans, I believe we're prepared to vote.
Mr. Eisenbacher?
Yes.
Mr. Neal?
Yes.
Mr. Lambert?
Yes.
Mr. Sanzica?
Yes.
Mr. Clark?
Yes.
Mr. Courtney?
Yes.
Mr. Desmond?
Yes.
Congratulations, you have your variance. On to item number 4C, this is related to a variance request. Jolie and Scott Pett, 3521 Shakespeare, and this is in order to construct a two-story addition to a house. A 6-foot variance to the required 45-foot rear yard setback is requested. Mr. Evans, could you address the board, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to direct everyone's attention to the overheads again, where I've have an aerial of the neighborhood. Now, this property is in a residential neighborhood north of Big Beaver and east of Coolidge Highway. It's the small square here near the middle of the overhead. I've zoomed in on the neighborhood here. It's on the west side of Shakespeare, 3521. Property is outlined here in red. The property and all surrounding property is zoned single-family residential, as indicated with the yellow overlay on the aerial. The applicant is requesting to add on to the rear of the house. In this survey, Shakespeare's to the right. The existing footprint of the house is shown, and the blue part is the existing, where the two-story addition will be, is proposed. Now, the addition should be, according to ordinance, 45 feet setback from the rear property line, and the site plan shows that's going to be just over 39 feet setback from the rear property line, so they need a 6-foot variance approval from this board to proceed. The applicant has provided the board elevation drawings showing the materials and the design of the proposed addition. I'll turn it back over to the board for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Are there questions of members for the city administration? Seeing none, we can call the petitioner forward, and if you can come forward and identify yourself and address the nature of your relationship to the property.
Good evening. My name is Joelle Pett, and I'm the homeowner of the property.
Great, and please don't forget to sign in. Thank you. Good evening. So if you want to address the board as to why you're requesting this variance, please proceed.
Yes, we moved in the house about 8 years ago, and since then our family's doubled in size, and we'd like to add on to our kitchen a 13 by 13 two-story addition. The addition would look and feel as if it was built with the house, with matching brick, siding, windows, and roof. Currently in that spot is a deck, so we would just be taking that deck, removing it, and building the addition. We have a huge deck as it is, so we would have plenty of deck still. We wouldn't build past that variance request.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for the petitioner? Mr. Courtney?
You said you were working with your subdivision association.
Yes, I am.
What do they do? Do they have architectural?
We have an architectural board. He's looked at it. He encouraged me to talk to the two neighbors directly behind us and next to us. We have done that. We brought them our plans. They have signed letters saying that they are in support of the build, as well as we went to 9 neighbors directly around us. We've shared our plans, and they have all signed saying that they have supported our build.
Have you shipped those in yet?
I have them right here.
Could you pass them to Mr. Lambert on the end, and then
Sure.
he'll pass them so everyone can see?
Thank
Then
you.
they'll be part of the record.
Okay, and one of our neighbors is a realtor, and he submitted a letter to the city as well as a copy in there saying that not only would it be a welcome addition, but also to add value to the house and the neighborhood.
Thank you.
You said you doubled the size of your family. Is that from 2 to 4 or from
We
12
were
to 20?
two. We were 2, and now we are 4.
Any other questions of the petitioner? We'll be passing these along. If there are any further questions on that, we'll call you, please, or we'll ask you to come back to the podium.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
So at this point in time, even though Mr. Eisenbacher is looking at the letters, I'm going to call on Mr. Eisenbacher for any letters here in a second, but I guess we can have the public hearing on this matter first. So I'll open the public hearing on this agenda item. If you're here to address the board related to this agenda item, please proceed to the podium and identify yourself. Seeing that there is not any speakers, we're going to close this portion out. The public comment section is closed. And Mr. Eisenbacher, if you can address the various communications that we have on file from the general public on this matter.
I count that there are 10 neighbors in favor. One of them had 2 pages in favor. So 10 individual homeowners, one of them not signed though. So the rest are all in the handwriting of the reported neighbor, and they are all on the same street. And two on the street behind.
Okay, thank you. At this point in time, we'll return the matter to the board and ask for any comments or any business that might be conducted. Anyone can make a motion at this time. Mr. Lambert, did you have something? No?
I was going to give another board member the opportunity, but I'll be happy to hasten this along. I would move that we approve the variance based upon the unusual characteristics of the property's shape and size, and the fact that it will not directly impact adversely the neighborhood based upon the responses of the neighbors.
Support.
Motion made, and I believe it's seconded by Mr. Eisenbacher. Are any comments on the motion related to board members? Seeing there isn't any. Mr. Evans, we're prepared for a vote.
Mr. Neal?
Yes.
Mr. Lambert?
Yes.
Mr. Sanzika?
Yes.
Mr. Clark?
Yes.
Mr. Courtney?
Yes.
Mr. Desmond?
Yes.
Mr. Eisenbacher?
Yes.
Motion passes. Congratulations, you have your variance. Have a good evening. So at this point in time, we are going to be moving on to item number 5, which is communications. Mr. Evans, do you have anything on file for us? So the answer is no. We're going to move on to item number 6. Is there any miscellaneous business that Mr. Evans or Ms. Dufresne have for us?
I don't think I've spoken this much at a meeting ever. But I know many of you know Susan Lancaster of our office, and she is, much to my chagrin and many people in the city, she has decided to retire. So we are having a small, a get-together for her on Friday, April 24th. We are having an open house from 9 to 12 in the city attorney's office here on the second floor. So I know many of you know who Sue is, and she's been a valuable asset for the city and for this board for many years. So if you would like to come and say goodbye to Sue, I'm sure she would sincerely appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. I know that she served in your role here on this board. She took a flight of time here, and we really appreciated her efforts on the city's behalf. So definitely our best wishes to her in her retirement. And now we can move on to public comment. Yes, I'm sorry.
One quick question for Mr. Evans.
Yes, Mr.
Next
Lambert.
month is May. Do we elect officers in May or June?
I think it is May.
Okay.
believe it's May.
Just so
Yeah.
everyone's aware and they can launch their campaigns.
Yes.
And at this point in time, we're going to move to public comment on any item that the general public would like to comment. And I would just state that since one item was removed from our agenda earlier, that the board is not in possession of any variance requests before it. So please adjust your comments to the fact that there is a lack of business before this board. And namely, that particular item is not before this board in any manner. So if you'd like to address the public, to the board, if you're part of the general public, please come forward and please identify yourself. And then you'll also have to sign in the sheet, please.
Good evening. My name is Diana Lottie from 1308 Boyd. Would I be allowed to ask a question?
You can make a comment.
I can make a
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure I understood so that I don't have to bother Paul in his office anymore with phone calls or emails. But I understand the reasoning for the removal of 4A, but I just want to understand if this means that the petitioner can now build on the full lot if he chooses to do so. He would just have to bring the building plans back. I know he had said he could build up to 6,300 square feet home there in a neighborhood of 1,000 to 1,200 square foot homes, so I don't think he would do that, but I just wanted to verify that's what would happen next. And is it a full year that he has to wait to come back if he wanted another variance?
Those are questions that would be put to the city administration.
It would
during
be.
normal business hours.
It would be.
Yes,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay, Paul, I will be calling you then. All right. I just thought maybe I could get a clarification tonight.
Thank you.
And I thank you for
Yes,
the
absolutely.
last couple of months of giving this careful consideration.
Thank you. Make sure you sign in, please.
Oh, yes.
Okay, so that is item number 7. Any other members of the public wishing to speak to the board here tonight? Seeing none, I'll close this portion out. And last item is adjournment, and I hope everybody has a great evening. It looks like it's not raining, so that's good. Have a good evening.
What's the weather?